You're listening to Sports Radio Detroit.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Platte NBA Minute right here on Sports Radio Detroit. How's everybody doing? I hope everybody is doing well. I hope the answer is well. I'm excited to do this episode because the episode I did earlier this week for the Last Track Review, the hip-hop podcast on Sports Radio Detroit, was a much more depressing conversation and episode as we were mourning the loss of the great Nipsey Hussle, a phenomenal rapper, activist, just community leader. He wore so many hats, and of course was a great entrepreneur as well. So go check out that episode. I did a tribute to him where I broke down all my favorite songs by him. Of course, brought the facts of the case at the time. That was before the suspect was apprehended and in police custody. But beyond that, I also talked about his influence, just all of the endeavors that he was doing, because Nipsey was a great man who did a lot of great things and was doing a lot of great things, and I really feel was a loss that is not easy to take and a loss that will affect this world. I know there's a lot of people that, maybe just don't like rap or don't have their ear to rap, so they don't know Nipsey like that. But trust me, I want everyone to go listen to that podcast and just learn about who he was, because he was a tremendous human being. This was a loss on a universal scale, a big time loss to the human race. So rest in peace, Nipsey Hussle. Once again, my thoughts and prayers are with the family, and please go check that out if you haven't. Anyways, beyond that, I am excited for this episode, despite feeling a little bit under the weather here. I'm sure you could probably tell in my voice. I'm a little bit of I got a little bit of a bug going on with me right now, but I'm excited. I waited to do this episode. Normally I upload on Wednesdays / early Thursday morning, but I wanted to wait until after the game because there was several games actually last night that were very important. Detroit, Miami, and Brooklyn all played, and that's what today's episode will be about. It will be dedicated entirely to the Eastern Conference playoff race. So I'm going to break down who's going to make it, who we as casual NBA fans should root for, if there's any potential upset ability between any of these teams. I'm going to get into the numbers, going to take a deep dive on each team. But first, all three teams lost last night. Detroit lost to Indiana, Brooklyn lost to Toronto, and Miami lost to, I believe it was Milwaukee. Let me just double check that really quick while I'm here, because I'm blanking on who Miami played last night. Boston, sorry. Yes. So all teams suffered double-digit losses, and now the standings, the way they are broken down, is one game separates Detroit at 6th and Miami at 9th. Brooklyn and Orlando are tied for 7th, just a half a game in between, or half a game ahead of Miami and a half a game behind Detroit. So it is a very, very tight race. Detroit has 4 games left. The other 3 teams have 3 left, so that is an advantage for Detroit. In fact, Detroit's playoff odds right now are at 94.8%. As of this moment, as I'm recording the podcast. Let's kind of jump into it. There is a scenario, though, that Detroit doesn't make it, and this scenario is if all 4 teams end with a tie. If all 4 teams end with a tie, Detroit would be bounced out of the playoffs. Now, that was according to yesterday. I'm not sure. I'd have to double-check the tiebreaker just because Miami losing to Boston, Detroit actually clinched a better Eastern Conference record. So I think the way it goes, I think that's no longer in place. I'd have to actually double-check on that. But yeah, that is pretty much at this point the only possibilities, that if Detroit loses out and these other teams win their final games, including Brooklyn, Miami, which we'll get to as a big time game. But let's just start with the teams. So I think, and I think I want to start with Detroit, since this is a Sports Radio Detroit podcast. This is a general NBA podcast, but who am I kidding? A lot of our listeners are Detroit Pistons fans, so we'll start there. Detroit is bottom 5 in pace, effective field goal, and true percentage on the year, but actually since January 1st, they have improved to middle of the pack in all of those areas except pace, where they actually rank dead last. now. They're slower than the Grizzlies. I mean, the Grizzlies aren't necessarily the grinded out Grizz anymore, but that being said, the Pistons are the slowest team in the NBA, and that makes a lot of sense if you watch them. It's a lot of just Blake isolation or dribble, 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 pick and roll, off-ball screens, pin downs, all that kind of stuff for the shooters. Just a very slow-paced, grinded-out offense. They are top 12 in defense, and that's since January 1st as well. But what the Pistons are doing well is they are shooting a lot of threes and making them at a good percentage. In fact, they are the only team in the NBA that has a greater percentage of their points coming from three, meaning how many points are generated from their three-pointers, is Houston. That is the only other team in the NBA, and they actually have a pretty wide margin, a 7-point margin differential, but Detroit is averaging 36.3 points per game just from the 3-point line. So Detroit has really relied on the three, and they've been making it at a good percentage, and they've been coming together. Drummond has absolutely stepped his game up. I've criticized him. I'm sure a lot of Detroit fans have criticized him. He's a very controversial, polarizing star player in Detroit in his time. He's a player that at time can not necessarily give maximum effort and look to take possessions off, but at the same time, he's so talented that he can get 15 rebounds effortlessly in a game, it seems like, and he has all the tools to dominate at a very, very high level. Blake looks fatigued here and there a couple games down the stretch. Last week I think now 2 weeks ago against Portland, Blake looked pretty fatigued, but he's still playing amazing. Reggie's been mostly consistent, playing solid. That's a huge, huge thing for Detroit. That's a huge reason Detroit is a better team. Just having somebody that can do a little something as far as shot creating besides Blake Griffin is absolutely huge. And the bench mob comes and goes. Ish has a lot of great games. Don's had some great stretches. So the team has been great. Of course, the addition of Wayne Ellington has been absolutely huge. Luke Kennard's been red hot from three for quite a while now. Langston Galloway even had his stretch off the bench where he made, I believe it was 13 straight threes before. I'd seen it was 12, but then I'm pretty sure he made one the following game. But he made 12 or 13 threes in a row over the span of like 3 or 4 games. So he's been shooting well, but since then kind of struggles. So he comes and goes. That's kind of the theme of the bench. But Detroit has a solid bench overall. I like the bench. I like Thon Maker's ability to play with Blake and Drummond. That's a really awesome piece. Something that the Pistons didn't really have before making that trade. They didn't have a guy who could fit with both Drummond and Blake. And although there's a lot of times where Thon looks rough, like he doesn't catch a pass or he makes a terrible read on defense, he'll hit a three or he'll get a chase down block. He's pretty good at blocking shots. He's actually a little bit better than I thought he was. And there's times also on the court where he looks straight clumsy because he's got to fill out his frame. I feel like he's a player that has to grow into their body. And I mean that not from a physical aspect, but just from a coordination aspect. Like sometimes, and take it from me, a guy myself who's 6'6", but very clumsy, it takes a while to kind of learn how to play with size, especially for people that rapidly grow, like I assume Thon did and like I have myself. So, of course, Thon on a much larger scale at 7, I believe he's 7'3". So yeah, it sometimes takes a little bit of an adjustment, a little bit of just like a mental fortitude to kind of figure out, okay, to kind of really understand your own body, and you think you would because you're in it every day and you're playing every day, but there's a lot of times when Don will trip over himself and things of that nature, all stuff that I of course never did, of course not. There's absolutely no way. Thank God our team was never good enough in high school to have footage on basketball games because I'd have some pretty ugly highlights. Let's jump to Brooklyn. Actually, I was deciding what team to jump to. Let's just jump to Brooklyn. Brooklyn, they've been middle of the pack defensively. They allow a lot of points off turnovers and second chance points. On offense, though, they're pretty solid. they excel at shooting threes and free throws, so you would think their offensive rank is a little bit higher than it is, or should be a little bit higher than it actually is. I believe they're ranked 18th as of right now. Yeah, 18th as of right now, but yet their offense is a little bit their offense is predicated on threes and free throws, and they're one of the highest teams in both threes and free throws. They're top 5, top 10 in each of those categories. So they're great at that, and that's a sign of an efficient offense. And of course, D'Angelo Russell has looked absolutely phenomenal this last now probably about 40 games. He's looked phenomenal. I'd say probably about 30. So he's playing great basketball. Spencer Dinwiddie is looking a little bit more acclimated. The team's got they have firepower. They have great shooters. They have a couple people who could create for others and themselves. And I like Jared Allen, so I like their team. They do a lot of do a lot of good things. They're well coached. They play hard. They play with an effort that a lot of teams don't play with normally. But that's going to be something that's a little bit diminished come this stretch when everybody's fighting for the playoff spot. So every team is going to be giving it their best every single game. And also beyond that, Brooklyn will also, if they get to the playoffs, they'll lose a little bit of that edge, because they've kind of been a team that you just don't really want to play during the regular season. Not that you can't beat them, because you can, but they're a team that will give on most nights effort, a higher level of effort than most teams, and that again is a credit to their coaching staff. I like Brooklyn. The thing about Brooklyn versus Detroit has the easiest schedule remaining, playing Memphis, New York, and who's the other team? They play Memphis, New York, and let's see here. Give me 1 second. 1 second here, because Brooklyn has a much tougher schedule right now. Brooklyn plays Milwaukee, Indiana, and then Miami. So 3 good teams. Obviously, that Miami game is absolutely critical, must win for both sides, really, because it looks like there's pretty much no way that it's going to not come down to the final game. And I'm pulling up Detroit's schedule right now. Yeah, sorry. So they have the Grizzlies, the Knicks, the Hornets, and the Thunder in descending order. So it starts OKC, then Charlotte, then Memphis, then New York. So they have a pretty easy schedule. Charlotte at this point is basically eliminated. Let's check if they're officially eliminated from the playoff contention. I don't believe they are yet, but just because of the losses from last night, I don't believe they officially are eliminated, but let's double check here. No, they're not officially eliminated, but they would essentially have to win out, and one of these teams, either and Orlando or Detroit, would have to lose out, because I believe Brooklyn has a tiebreaker over Charlotte. So it'd have to be Miami losing out. It would have to be Miami, Detroit, and Orlando losing out for them to sneak into one of those final spots of the playoffs. But anyways, so Brooklyn has a much tougher schedule. Miami, though, to me, has the most difficult schedule. Now, Miami's been playing great. They're 6th in defensive rating since January 1st. Getting Dragic back has helped. Wade being Wade is awesome. It's cool to see one last time. He played Boston for the last time, final night, presumably, assuming they don't make it to the playoffs and play it against Boston in like the second round or the conference finals, which won't happen. But again, you have to tentatively say that it might be their last game. It's not definitive at this point. But yeah, they play Toronto, Philly, and Brooklyn. Brooklyn, of course, is going to be the game that matters the most. But from Miami's perspective, being a half a game out, they're going to have to pick up at least one of those wins against Toronto or Philly. Both very good teams. Toronto's playing absolutely their best basketball. They crushed the Nets last night, even though they only won by, I believe the final score was a 10-point win. But they are so crisp and smooth. and they play and they play so well together, especially when Kawhi plays. Again, Toronto might rest Kawhi against Miami, so that's a big factor going into that game. But still, Toronto will be a tough game, and Philly, of course, will be a super tough game as well. That will again, it'll depend on players resting and all that, but still, I mean, even if Philly rests one or two of their best guys, they're still on paper a better team. So I don't see a way in Miami. I really don't see a way for Miami to get into the playoffs without picking up one of those wins, and I would put them as underdogs in at least two of those games. Brooklyn, I think it'd be a close battle, but I'd probably even put Brooklyn ahead of Miami in terms of a head-to-head battle. So Miami is the team to me that is a tough one to watch. They're going to be very or they're the one to watch because they have such a tough schedule, I should say. Orlando, on the other hand, once again regains fire. Now, if you remember, they're now 8-2 in their last 10, and a couple weeks ago, I want to say about a month ago, I did a podcast. It was early or mid March about when for Sports Radio Detroit, where I talked about I think the 8 in each conference are the final 8, and it's taken a while, and I really thought Orlando, because they were on fire. Miami looked like they were kind of tailing out a little bit. Charlotte looked like they were tailing out a little bit. It really looked like the final 3 in the East were going to be Brooklyn, Detroit, and Orlando. And so here we are now. I can't claim I was right because Miami's definitely since then jumped in the playoffs, been in and out of the playoffs. Orlando's fallen, but now once again they're surging, going 8-2 in their last 10. Their top 10 defense, top 3 defense since January 1st, and they're doing it despite being 14th at points in the paint. Once again, not great rim protection, but with a guy like Niko Vucevic, you're not expecting great rim protection. The thing that's interesting about this defense, though, is they are first in both opponents' points off turnovers and second chance points. So opponents score the lowest amount of points off turnovers and second chance points against Orlando than any other team. Now, the second chance points makes a lot of sense because they have a lot of size and a lot of good rebounding on their team. But the one that surprised me was the points off turnovers, because they don't necessarily have like a high level, like a Chris Paul type point guard, or I mean, James Harden, he has a lot of turnovers, but that's because he holds the ball so much. So I don't want to use him as a good example, but like a prime Jose Calderon. Like, remember when Jose was in Toronto and this guy was getting like 6 assists for every 1 turnover. Like, he was just phenomenal at holding the ball, making the right decisions, and really just setting his team up. And, so Orlando is a team that, I would think, based off of their personnel, DJ Augustine, who's a cool backup point guard, but the problem is he has to start for them. You would think that combined with young guys like Gordon, Isaac, that this team would kind of struggle, and especially Terrence Ross, who has a very scoring-centric mind. Usually those kind of players have a higher volume of turnovers. So you would think that this team is turning the ball over a lot and leading to a lot of easy points for other teams. But they are great. They are playing extremely disciplined on the defensive end of the floor. Absolute credit goes to Steve Clifford and the coaching staff there. Of course, they have an all-star scorer in Niko Vucevic, a guy who's a very talented big who can score. It'll be interesting to see what he does in free agency as a side note, but I'm as of right now, I mean, you got to just respect the game that he's playing and the fact that he is a guy who can absolutely get a bucket. He can stretch the floor. He can play in the post. He can do a little bit of everything offensively. Also, of these 4 teams, Orlando has the second easiest schedule. They play Atlanta, who's not an easy game anymore. Atlanta's been a team that's really played well down the stretch. Boston, that could be winnable. That could be very winnable. Orlando beat Boston earlier this year in that controversial Hayward play. And Boston's a team that just, man, they seem like they can't get it together. And Kyrie has talked about resting during the final few games. Now, I know they actually have a better record without Kyrie, but I don't believe that. I don't for 1 second think they're a better team without Kyrie than they are with him. So that's just a false narrative. But Boston is very beatable, is my point. And then Charlotte, who at that point presumably will have nothing to play for, and they might even do something as like to shut down Kemba for that game. So Orlando has a very winnable schedule moving forward. This again, I'd say the only easier one is Detroit. Oklahoma City Thunder are playing like garbage right now, and then New York obviously is New York. Memphis is winning some games. They're actually trying, so that might be a little bit of a battle, but still, Detroit should win that game. And then the other game is why do I keep blanking on the other game? Oh, sorry, Charlotte. Yeah. So Charlotte, who's very winnable, obviously, as we've seen over the stretch of the last like 15 games. So if you had to ask me right now, once again, I'd go with the three that I picked a month ago or around a month ago, which is Detroit, Brooklyn, and Orlando. I would assume that Orlando ends up 7th, just because Detroit. Because of the way Detroit play. Detroit has a tiebreaker over Orlando, and they have 4 games as opposed to 3 for Orlando. So I think Orlando will ultimately drop one of those 2 games, either Atlanta or Boston, and win the other 2. And I think Detroit will win 2 to 3 of their 4 games down the stretch, depending on how much they rest Blake Griffin. And then Brooklyn having such a tough stretch, Milwaukee, Indiana, and Miami. That is tough, but it's easier than Miami's schedule, which is Toronto, Philly, and Brooklyn. So if Miami loses this game against Toronto, then their back is absolutely against the wall against Philly. And Milwaukee, the way they're playing with Giannis hurt, maybe even resting, Brogdon out, Mirotic out. Indiana, again, they're a good team. That's a tough team. That's a tough team, but I would expect Brooklyn to lose, but they have a shot at winning that game, definitely. Indiana's far easier to play, I think, than Philly as of right now. Even though again, all respect to Indiana, and then Miami versus Brooklyn. Again, I would pick Brooklyn in that head-to-head. So Brooklyn, really, it's going to most likely come down to that game, because I could honestly see both Miami and Brooklyn losing both of their games before the final game. I could see Brooklyn dropping Milwaukee and Indiana. I could definitely see Miami dropping Toronto and Philly. So it might very well come down to that final game. But I do think my gut tells me that Brooklyn will find a way to pick up one of these wins against either Milwaukee or Indiana, and then ultimately beat Miami for the final playoff spot. But it would be fun as a casual NBA fan. I'm torn on who to root for. Obviously, Detroit's one of them, just because I think of these 4 teams, I think Detroit's the best team. And beyond that, obviously, just being a Piston fan, I'd like to see them in the playoffs again. Brooklyn's been fun this year. They've been great. And then that last spot between Miami and Orlando, as far as, again, not as far as like who will actually make it, but who I would prefer and who I think that casual NBA fans should prefer. It's tough, because, Miami on one hand, you got one more Wade playoff series. But, really, what are they going to do? Orlando's a team that they have some size. Like, if they finish 7th or 8th, they actually, don't forget, like a month ago or a couple weeks ago, they beat Toronto. And they beat them pretty bad. Now, they didn't have Kawhi. And, of course, that wasn't a playoff game. Things of that nature. But Orlando has some impressive wins against some top-tier teams. And they have a lot of size and versatility. And again, just being an elite on one end of the floor, I think definitely gives them a chance to at least make it a little bit more challenging of a series. So Orlando's also a fan base that's struggling too. So obviously being a Pistons fan and knowing what that fan base has been through, I'm rooting for Orlando. This would be their first time in the playoffs since Dwight Howard. Boy, doesn't that feel like forever ago. I was a kid in middle school when Dwight Howard and the Orlando Magic were considered a viable team. So man, time flies. So I'm definitely rooting for Orlando, and I think the casual fan should too. Again, sorry Miami. And if I had to rank potential upset ability, it depends because I don't really see a scenario where Detroit finishes eighth just because of the way the tiebreakers play out. And just given the schedule of games that Detroit has, I would be shocked if they finished, let's say eighth and played Milwaukee. So I don't think Detroit can beat or even come close to beating Toronto or Philly. I think the crazy thing I'm about to say is, despite how good they've been, but it's just where they're at. Milwaukee's the most beatable team. So to me, it comes down to the eighth seed. That's the most beatable first round team, I think, in my opinion, as of right now. Just because, you could argue that Philly is a team that could collapse, and and when back against the wall, they could all the stars could turn on each other and blah blah blah. But they just have so much damn talent on that roster. I don't see any of these teams holding a candle to that. Um, Milwaukee, just because of their injuries, like Giannis is hurt right now, like he's hobbled. Um, Brogdon's out, Mirotic is out. Brogdon's a huge, huge loss for them, and he'll be out for at least the first round of the playoffs, if not part of or all of the second round. So to me, Milwaukee's actually the most beatable, despite them being a fantastic team. And if a team like Orlando gets Milwaukee, now again, Milwaukee has no rim protection, so with that being said, Giannis would score a lot of points at the paint. So maybe you can maybe argue that Brooklyn's a better matchup just because they have a little bit better paint protection than Orlando. But Orlando has a lot of size. Like they have Vucevic, who doesn't obviously have the lateral quickness to stay in front of Giannis, but physically is a big body that Giannis can't just back down easily. And then you have Aaron Gordon and Jonathan Isaac, and you got some longer wings you can throw at Giannis, even Terrence Ross. That being said, though, Orlando, I would worry about them. I would worry about them offensively, just because Terrence Ross, I don't know if his game exactly translates to the playoffs. Vucevic, again, I don't know how well his game translates to the playoffs. I don't know how well this defense overall translates to the playoffs. So between Brooklyn and Orlando, though, I would end up going with Orlando just because of, again, I think their size, and if they were matched up against either Toronto or Milwaukee, they've fared pretty well against Toronto and Milwaukee. I think they just kind of match up pretty well with. The only flaw again would be the rim protection, and I don't know what they do on offense, which are huge things. Again, I don't think any of these teams are getting anything more than a game in any of their series. But if you have to tell me one that's a potential upset, I guess it's Orlando over Milwaukee. I mean, I don't see it. I don't see Brooklyn beating. I don't see Brooklyn coming close to beating Milwaukee, being able to handle Giannis, or even come close to beating Toronto, who I think is maybe the best team in the East as of right now, and Detroit. I don't see Detroit beating Kawhi and the Raptors. I don't see Detroit beating Giannis, and I don't see how Detroit can even stop Embiid and Philly, because Embiid, number one, owns Drummond. Number two, what the hell are they going to do about Ben Simmons? And then not to mention Jimmy Butler and Tobias. So that's a lethal combination of talent. So there you have it. That's my thoughts on the Eastern Conference playoff race. Once again, this is the Sports Radio Detroit NBA Minute podcast. Sorry, I almost said the hip hop podcast. I'm your host, Chris Platte. Please hit me on Twitter at Real Chris Platte. You can also do Instagram as well, but Twitter's obviously better for communicating. Let me know your thoughts. Let me know who you think is the most has the most potential for an upset in the first round. Let me know who you think is the best is the best team of these four. Who are you rooting for when it comes to this playoff series? Who do you want to make it? Do you want Dwayne Wade's last dance? Do you want Orlando to end their playoff drought? Let me know at Real Chris Platte, and of course, tag at Sports Radio Detroit as well. Thank you, everyone, for listening. I'll be back with some more NBA talk next week, probably focusing on awards and some playoff preview stuff. So we'll see how that one goes. That will probably be a longer episode. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Have a great day, and I'll see you next week with some more hip-hop and NBA content for Sports Radio Detroit.
This has been an SRD production.
Because I feel like a salad tossing might feel good.
What?
Out of Bounds Detroit podcast. Tuesday morning and Friday mornings here on SportsRadioDetroit.com.